Welcome to the Thunder and Lightning Show. John the Son of Thunder here with Ryan the Retrograde. And I just want to say a special thank you to everyone who's subscribed to this channel. 500 subscribers is awesome. Thank you so much. Today we want to talk about Pope Benedict XVI. He made some statements recently, and I'm going to quote most of my quotes from a LifeSite News article. He said that he maintained the spiritual aspect of the papacy, and this was very confusing to a lot of people. And so, Ryan, what are your thoughts on Benedict's comments?
So, we've been through this like 10 million times, that there continues to be this controversy about what in the world is the Pope Emeritus, because it was basically just invented by Pope Benedict. This LifeSite article was great. The title of it, by the way, is called Pope Benedict, I Resigned, but I Kept Spiritual Dimension of Papacy. So in the article, there was apparently a book that's going to come out written by Pope Benedict and Peter Seewald, who is I believe he's a German journalist, author, whatever. He had published before interviews with Ratzinger, and those were turned into books. So the first part of the article summarizes what this book is about, Benedict's thoughts about being the so-called Pope Emeritus. Then they went and talked to Monsignor Nicola Bux, who worked in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And he read what Pope Benedict said, and he had this particular criticism, and this is what I want to point out to people. This is a quote from the article, and this part is quoting Monsignor Bux. Quote, the comparison of the papal office with the episcopal office. Now, here's the preliminary information, is that Pope Benedict said, okay, so like when a bishop quits, he retires, he's still a bishop. And so you make him a titular bishop of something, but he's bishop emeritus, and he's still a bishop. And so he has the powers to do bishop things. Now, Pope Benedict has this idea that when you quit the papacy, you are still in some way pope. And so you have these popish powers. And Monsignor Bux, as I continue here, the comparison of the papal office with the episcopal office, in what regards the abdication of the papal office, is not correct. The episcopal office is conferred by episcopal ordination or consecration, imprinting an indelible character on the soul of the bishop. Thus, while he may be relieved of a particular pastoral responsibility, he remains always a bishop. The papal office is conferred by the acceptance of the election to the See of Peter, that is, by an act of the will of the person elected, accepting the call to be the vicar of Christ on earth. From the moment that the person elected consents, he has the full jurisdiction of the Roman pontiff. So what Bux is pointing out is that getting elected pope is not a sacramental activity. There's no ordination that happens when you're elected pope. It's a purely juridical, it's purely governed by the law of the church. And the law of the church, specifically that there is an office of the pope, and these are more or less his powers, that's defined by the tradition. And then the method of choosing or electing the pope or producing a new one when the old one dies or quits, that's up to the church itself by the legislation of the church, and that's through the canon law and what the pope has decreed for the canon law, etc. So if you look back historically, the College of Cardinals is, I don't even know if it's 1,000 years old. Before that time, the popes were elected by the priests of Rome. And then at some point in time, then you had the College of Cardinals, where the Pope would appoint these special dudes who may be from other countries in the world, who will be this advisory body, and then when he dies, then they get together and then they elect the new Pope. So this thing must be understood quite well, that the Pope is a bishop who has been already ordained, and when he's elected pope, nothing new happens. Now, I've had a theory before about that the Pope, this is totally speculation here. My theory, I've discussed this with other people, priests, and they've poked holes in this theory, so take this with a grain of salt. But in the Middle Ages, and probably maybe even back into the before that, maybe even into the late patristic period, when a pope was elected, he was crowned and he took a papal oath. And those two things, the oath said, I'm going to keep the faith, I'm not going to innovate, and if I do, let the blessed apostles Peter and Paul curse me. Then I got this, then he was crowned with a coronation which delineated these are the powers of the Pope. Okay? And so with that in mind, this kind of delineates the powers of the Pope. And this is not a sacrament, so you can give it away, you can die, anyway, you're replaced. And but this article points out some important things in that respect, and I think there's holes there in Pope Benedict's understanding here. So another point that I wanted to make here along these same lines is that, because I had been, remember when we did the show on the Sedevacantists and SSPX and Eastern Orthodox. So I did some research into the Sedevacantist position and how they understand this. And of course, they're not making anything up. They're reading things from the authority of the church, from the fathers, from the theologians, from the canon law. And Bishop Sanborn, for instance, he pointed out that the papacy the election of the papacy is a juridical event. So, for instance, in Pope Paul IV's bull, I think it's Cum ex apostolatus, it says these are the conditions about electing somebody the Pope. If he's a heretic, he can't be elected. And this was a law that governed papal elections. I think the opinion is that that's been abrogated and that law doesn't exist anymore. But regardless, Bishop Sanborn pointed out that the election of a Pope is purely juridical. Hence, the law and method of election can change, and you can quit. And this is key. You can also be impeded by church law in your quitting, or the method of quitting, or understanding the quitting, this kind of thing. Because the office of the papacy in this respects, or the quitting of the papacy, or the taking it up, is governed by church law. So that's important. Now, the last thing that I wanted to mention about this is so I said, let me read the comments in this article. By the way, read it. It's a great article. I read the comments in this LifeSite piece, and there were three camps of people who commented on this. The first camp says Pope Francis is a heretic who is still Pope, and we're just waiting until he either dies or somebody challenges him, and we have a canonical hearing on whether he lost the papacy because of heresy. You have a second camp who say that Benedict is still Pope, and he's a terrible Pope too because he's so heterodox that he doesn't even understand the papacy. I mean, you can kind of see this in there. He has no idea what he's doing. He's making up this office of Pope Emeritus. He thinks that it has these powers when it doesn't. I mean, it's like if being the Pope is a juridical office, then quitting it, you don't keep anything. Once you quit the office, there's no spiritual powers anymore. You're just an ordinary bishop. That's it. And so for him to think that somehow he still bears this Petrine ministry or munus or whatever is not in any way found in the tradition of the church. He totally concocted that. And so this is where you get into the Anne Barnhart thesis that because of substantial error, he is still Pope. And you can argue that because it's clear I don't see how you can jive what he says with what the law and the tradition of the church is. So that's the group two of the people who are reading, commenting here. And then group three is the people the Sedevacantists who say, you know what, Francis is a fake pope, and Benedict, you can see he's totally out there in left field. He can't have the faith either, so he's also a fake pope. So in that comment box, you have basically three groups of people, all of whom agree that both Francis and Benedict are heretics. That's the point where we're at now. This is the madness that exists, and I'm not criticizing those people. Who I am rightly criticizing is these popes, because the situation is so chaotic and discombobulated Nobody knows right or wrong. What does it mean when you quit the papacy? What's the powers of the papacy? What this is all about? It's madness.
And we have hindsight to support our position and say this is so ridiculous. Why did Benedict ever resign in the first place? But I think an even bigger question is, why did the Cardinals allow him to resign? Because you see, like John Paul II, towards the end of his life, he wasn't doing hardly anything. He was very sick.
Yeah.
Before he was traveling the world, going all over the place. And Benedict, I think the excuse that we got whenever Benedict resigned was, oh, well, he's having health problems, and JP2 set a standard where the Pope has to travel everywhere. And no, he doesn't.
Yeah.
And I don't know, why did these cardinals not think to say, no, you can't quit to be Pope? That would cause a lot of confusion, because what we see right now, we see Benedict making statements, so like the Cardinal Sarah in Pope Benedict's book on celibacy, on clerical celibacy, whenever Pope Francis was about to propose that married men can become priests.
Yeah.
So Benedict's interfering with the current Pope, which I think is a good thing in my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, in the current situation, but the precedent it sets is ridiculous.
And the problem here is this. Well, first, let's go back to the time when Pope Benedict quit. When he quit, I thought, didn't you, and a lot of people thought this, didn't you think, oh, he has a terminal cancer, he's going to get treatments, and he'll be dead in a few months? That's what I thought. I thought without question he's going to undergo these treatments, he's going to be totally incapacitated, and he's going to die. And so obviously he can't take care of this papacy and this church anymore, so he's quitting. But then you had this thing where he fake quit, and he decided, well, I'm still going to wear white, and I'll still be Pope Benedict, but you can call me Emeritus, and I'm still in the vineyard of Peter, and I still have a spiritual dimension and all this stuff. And and he's still alive. Okay, I'm glad that
7 years later.
I'm glad that he's alive, but why are you clinging? If you quit the papacy, then quit the papacy, actually, and go back and be Bishop Joseph Ratzinger, take off that white outfit, stop calling yourself Benedict, and then you can be free to give whatever opinions you want, because you're just an ordinary bishop and nobody cares about you. Well, I mean, we would care about him if he preaches orthodoxy, if he's a stalwart of tradition, then we would rally behind him, just like we rally behind Schneider and Burke, and now Mueller. Mueller is on the side of the good guys. It's a shame Pope Benedict didn't actually really quit the entirety of the papacy and become one of the good guys, one of the good bishops. So another person to blame is Pope Francis in this whole thing. Pope Francis could command him, take off that white cassock and stop pretending to be Pope, and stop calling yourself Benedict, and enough with this silliness about I'm still in the vineyard of Peter and spiritual dimension. If Pope Francis is Pope, okay, then he needs to act like it and put this usurper out of the way. Throw him out of the Vatican, send him off to some place in a black cassock or with the purple trim because he's a bishop, and tell him either tell him don't say anything, or I don't care what you do, but just get away from here and stop pretending to be Pope. One of those things should happen. Or maybe Benedict should finally wake up and say, hey, you know what, that was all a joke. I'm still Pope. I'm taking this thing back. I'm getting the gang together again, and he can gather some cardinals and they'll take back the Vatican. I don't know. One of those things should happen, but the situation that we're in now is the worst of all situations, where you have a zombie Pope, and I won't even say anything about Pope Francis, but you have one zombie Pope and one destroying Pope, and no popes would be better than two popes. That's what I have to say about that.
Well, that's why the sede vacantis position is really convenient at this point.
It is, yeah.
So what was your thought process whenever you heard that Benedict resigned? I'm curious to get your...
Well, I was really sad. I was sad because he was just, remember one of the last things that he did before he quit was he had that address about Vatican II. Do you remember this? No. Where he criticized Vatican II, the spirit of Vatican II, that the council was off the rails. And it was oh man, he's just woken up. But then the shame was, and I don't know if this precipitated them forcing him out of office, but then he quit. And he was slowly bringing back a more traditional form of the liturgy of the new Mass. He was letting free the tradition even more and more. He was basically had a deal worked out with SSPX. But then whatever happened, and again, I thought that he had like a cancer and only had a month or two to live. So that's kind of what I thought about the whole thing. And then I thought, well, we'll be in good shape because there'll be some guy from the Benedict camp who will get elected, whether that's Cardinal Scola or somebody like maybe, I don't think I ever thought Burke would get elected, but he was a dream at that time that Burke would get elected. Or somebody like a Ratzinger type who was in the JP2 camp, but in the conservative, semi-traditionalist wing of that camp. Like Arinze was another guy. I think he might have been over 80. Yeah. Or Sarah. I don't know if Sarah was known at that time, but those were my thoughts.
And what was your reaction to Francis getting appointed?
Well, I didn't know anything about him, so I can tell you that the first time when he showed up on that balcony, I had like this feel of doom that came over my soul. I knew nothing about the guy, but I just saw him walk out there, and I was like, eep, this is bad. And I knew nothing about the guy, but I just had this internal feeling that this dude's bad, or this is something bad's going to happen to the church with this whole thing. And I knew nothing about him, and a lot of people, I've heard from priests, lay people, priests have told me that certain bishops have conveyed this information to them, that they too felt this like sinking feeling of doom when they saw Francis out there on that on the balcony.
Well, for me, as soon as I heard that Benedict resigned, I immediately started thinking of prophecies.
Oh,
like
really?
What? I was like, this is unprecedented.
Yeah.
Like, this is rotten. Like, what happened?
Yeah.
And I just immediately assumed the worst. And I think, like, I was a Novus Ordo Catholic at that point. No, like, I hardly had any knowledge of the Latin Mass or anything. But immediately, the one prophecy that people started bringing up was the prophecy of St. Malachi, which has been proven probably fraudulent. But it said the next pope, which would be what Pope Francis is right now, would be the final pope.
Peter
it would be
the
called
Roman.
Peter the Roman.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, like, Benedict Contis will have a field day with this because they'll say, oh, well, Francis isn't pope, so the next pope will be
Yeah.
the final pope and the end of the world. But I was looking into that and I was like, okay, I guess I was able to convince myself this is going to be all right. And then I had a weird feeling when Francis was announced as pope.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was like a feeling of doom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can look back and say, oh yeah, I had a feeling, but it's a weird feeling because like whenever there's a new pope, everyone's celebrating.
Yeah,
and
usually
everything.
you're happy.
Like Vive el Papa or something.
But
now it was, I don't know if it happened because it was at night, but then the lightning struck the Vatican. And
that was when he quit, when
Benedict
announced his
quit.
quitting. Yeah.
So it was a weird feeling, and I actually came around a lot later than most people on Pope Francis. Because a lot of people were very skeptical after a while, but
I actually wrote privately a denunciation of him like a month into the papacy, and I never published it because I said this isn't appropriate. First off, I'm just a layman or whatever, but I thought something was up immediately. It was like from the first day when he decided to carry his bags out of the Casa Santa Marta, and I said he doesn't understand the papacy here. That it's not about you and you trying to be humble and carry bags. This is about you submitting yourself to the church and to the tradition, and you're forced. And under humility, you need to do what we tell you to do, and that's we carry your bags. You're not in charge here, Pope. You're the servant of the tradition and the church. So you put on the outfit that's very heavy and ostentatious, and you have these guys carry your bags, and you sit in this chair, and we carry you around, because you're not in charge. The tradition instructs you. You don't instruct and change the tradition. So that's the first thing. And I said that to me, this is a false humility. It's a false humility to break the tradition and to try to be like one of the guys. Hey, I'm just one of the guys. Hey, let's smoke a cigarette. Let's shoot some basketball. Hey, no, you're Pope. You don't shoot basketball. I guess you can smoke a cigarette. I mean, Pius X did. But you're not going to hang out with the boys anymore. You're now Pope. It's like when you get married, you're not one of the guys. You're not going to the bar. You're not going fishing all the time. You've got to like fix things at home and take care of the kids and whatever. So you're no longer your own man. Bachelorhood is over. So when you're elected Pope, bachelorhood is over, if you ever had it. I mean, you were a cardinal before, but you're not doing your own thing. You've got to wear the outfit. You've got to do all this stuff. There's no more freelancing anymore. So that was like a few weeks into the papacy that I started to get really, really skeptical of this whole thing. And I thought that there was something rotten in the state of Denmark, so to speak.
Well, another thing that was interesting was how much Francis was embraced by the liberal media.
Yeah.
And it was, they hated Benedict. They absolutely hated Benedict. And then when Francis came along, oh, he's this awesome guy.
Remember one thing, though. Do you remember this? It was like maybe the first month of his papacy that they were after him. Remember they were trying to tie him to the Argentine dirty war, and they accused him of being a collaborator with the Peron movement, and that he was responsible for getting some of these dissident priests tortured who happened to be like communists or whatever. So the mainstreams were against Pope Francis for a few weeks. Then he started inviting the homosexuals. He said stuff about the breeding like rabbits, etc. Then the media was like, "Oh, a bold breath of fresh air from the papacy. What will Francis bring to the Catholic Church?" And that's when it was like, okay, my suspicions seem to be confirmed here. This stinks. Something's rotten here. If the mainstreams are now applauding you.
Yeah, and if you look at Francis's past in Argentina, I believe the priest's name is Father Grossi, who he covered up for. I don't know. I could be wrong on that. Go ahead and look it up on Google. Father Grossi, with the G, is the priest that he presumably covered up for. But they stopped looking into their past once they turned liberal.
Father
right?
Ricci?
Father Rica...
Monsignor Ricci?
I don't know.
He was like I believe he was the Argentine guy that he moved to the Vatican. Was this the guy that was alleged?
No, this was a different one.
Different dude. Okay.
Yeah, there's so many predators in the Vatican. I mean, it's hard to keep track. But no, Monsignor Rica. He was the one who had the cocaine orgy in the Vatican. And
that was allegedly Cocoa. Wasn't that Cocoa Puffs?
It's hard to keep track.
I don't know. There's so many of
who...
these crazy things. No, I think I know who you're talking about. That was the incident where there was that woman that asked him the question, "Why did you cover up for it?" And he was like, "No," and then he walked away.
That was the original one I was talking about.
Grossi.
But Rica was the one who he said, "Who am I to judge?"
That was that one. Yeah.
And it's crazy. It's ridiculous. But I guess to tie things up here, I don't know. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Other than read that article, it's really good. Think about this and study it. Understand what this is something that, for instance, Timothy Flanders has talked about, that there is this false spirit of Vatican I that has infected the church since the First Vatican Council, that like the Pope is some kind of Superman who can do as he chooses. And that's not true. And so now with this time of error that we see coming from the papacy, that it's time to examine, what are the powers of the Pope, and what exactly goes into a papal election, and the theory, and actually what the Church teaches about, what is the office of the papacy, and how do you get it. And that's something that's worth looking into. And don't just read any Joe Blow's opinion, but try to go to the original sources, the theologians like St. Robert Bellarmine, and also what the Church has taught through Vatican I, and any other encyclicals that the popes have written.
I'm going to say, as far as Benedict being Pope, I personally think that Francis is Pope. That's my personal opinion. And like we said, we can see how people can make a case for anything really at
Anything
this
is
point.
possible. It's a mess.
And someone like Anne Barnhart, she's kind of shut out by a lot of the more mainstream people, but she has credibility. The Sedevacantist have credibility, and the people like me that think Francis is Pope, we have credibility
Yeah.
as well, and
Yeah.
we kind of have to.
Yeah.
But we're not, like, there's no hard evidence to support really anything.
I think, yeah, I would agree. Maybe you could make the point that the Sedevacantists could be wrong, are wrong, because of St. Robert Bellarmine's opinion that if the Pope does become a heretic, you have to have a judgment by an imperfect council. And then that way he's no longer Pope, and then the Church can move forward. But, they have a good response to that, and it's like, well, the disease has infected so many of the cardinals too, and you have this discombobulation, this confusion that exists up there in the upper echelons of the Church. So,
we're just not going to be able to tell for certain what's real until Benedict actually speaks up. He says everything that's ever happened to him,
Yeah.
why he give
or
us the real
dies,
reasons.
if he dies.
If he dies. Well, what about this situation? If Francis dies before Benedict, then I mean, can you imagine what would happen?
I don't know what if that's...
I try to imagine scenarios, and I'm like, there are just too many to think about. And so until we have more evidence, more information, it's impossible to really make a definitive judgment on
Yeah.
that. But until then, I just have to make my best judgment, and I think Francis is Pope. And as much as I wish Benedict were Pope, I'm still going to pray for Francis. I mean, you pray for him anyway, even if he weren't Pope. But that's the case, and
But by the way, another thing that I thought whenever Benedict quit was I thought that maybe he got a locution from God that says, quit, I'm going to do something here, whether it's really good for the Church or punishment to bad guys, but step aside. And maybe this has to do with the third secret of Fatima was another thing. But so I thought maybe there was something big, that God was going to do something big, and let's get Pope Benedict out of the way. Because next comes the super Pope who's going to, take the Church on his back and fix all the problems. That didn't happen.
All right, well, we'd like to hear your comments. I'm sure you have plenty. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.
Peace.